It's a survey of a bunch of approaches that either people have heard of and don't really do as comprehensively, or at least I don't see people doing as comprehensively as I think would be useful in practice, or stuff that's kind of obscure because it's weird and academic, or people haven't discovered it yet, or I made it up. It's all things that I think are valuable. The structure here is all you have to do for guaranteed successful design is make sure you're designing the right thing, and you have to design it well. This premise was borrowed from a talk at South by Southwest. I've never been to South by Southwest, but it was Dan Gilbert's keynote in 2006. So I borrowed this somewhat snarky structure from him. It's very simple to put it forward being this easy, but it's not actually a particularly easy situation. So the sequence is design the right thing, design it well. We're going to flip that around. We're going to talk about design techniques specifically in the first half, and then the second half is going to be the context of how do you find the right problems to design and work on. So we're going to talk about solving things better. Number one, separate function from implementation. This is the foundation of an approach called axiomatic design. I accidentally took this class in grad school. It was in the industrial engineering department. It was completely not what I thought it was going to be. And this is a cliche, but no, it actually for real changed my life. Like, this changes how I think about design. This changes how I think about communication. This changes how I think about humans' personal goals. By the way, the slides are all going to be posted, so feel free to take a picture of every slide, but the PDF and the deck is going to be posted. Don't worry about that. These are examples of implementations. This is how we're going to do it. If you're talking about this stuff, it's too late and you're already doomed. When you're talking early about design, you want to talk about the function. You want to talk about the capability that you're giving to someone. And so as soon as you say it's going to be a list, as soon as you say it's going to be an app, it's going to be mobile, these are all manifestations. They're single channels of possible solution. Really what we're talking about, what we want to be talking about for as long as you can before you get stuck and attached to a particular implementation, we want to talk about the functionality. We want to talk about the capability. And so this is an end state. And so the fact that I selected a value from a list, your user's goal is not to pick a value from a list. Your user's goal is to have the information communicated through the interface usefully so they can get their work done, right? And so, we talk about, well, it has to be portable. Why does it have to be portable? The exercise I did in this class involved designing a thing that was portable, and we failed instantaneously because portable is an implementation. And what we really wanted was something that was available all the time. And available is a really different conversation from portable, right? Available means like build into doorknobs, build into your car dashboard. It could be anywhere. Portable means like, okay, now it's got to have a power supply. It's got to have I/O channels. It's, I've got to be able to get the data on and off of it. Like, that's a whole separate problem space than just saying I need to have this technology available to me wherever I go. So that's kind of the change in how the thinking goes. As soon as you start talking about implementations, now you're stuck in this rut of one particular flavor of solution, and you fail to see all the other possibilities that the world allows. So here's just a little example. People say, I want to meet someone who's tall and dark and funny and rich, and these are all implementations. These are all things that we believe are going to satisfy functions for us, right? So what kind of functions are we talking about here? I want someone who's attractive. I mean, they have to be attractive to me. Now, if you're into tall and dark, that's great. If you're into like short and red hair, that's great. Like, if like hair color means absolutely nothing to you and you just don't care, that's great. But to specify that success is based on tall and dark versus success is based on attractive, you're stuck in a particular implementation when really you need the function to be satisfied. Similarly, I want someone who's funny. I want them to be entertaining, pleasant to be around by my estimation. Rich, what does that mean? I want someone who's stable financially. Or maybe I want the prestige of it. But there's very different ways of getting those. You could, for example, become romantically involved with a book author, and maybe there's prestige there, and maybe there isn't, but there's probably not richness there. So that's like totally different, right? So this is like a funny example. But people do this with their apps or their websites, right? Like, it has to be really exciting. It has to be super engaging. We want people to think it's beautiful. We want people to use our tools. Now that means they probably have to enjoy them and have a positive experience, but people don't say we want people to enjoy our tools. Sometimes they do, but they say, it has to be exciting, it has to be sticky. Why? Well, so people come back and pay us more money. But we talk about how we're going to get there, not where we're trying to go. And that's a failure that we are all blind to and we all do all the time from day one. And debugging this is a really interesting experience, particularly when you're pointing it at yourself and you're like, how come I want to date someone who's, you know, tall and dark and funny and rich? Like, anyway. So that was one of however many of these we got to go on. Axiomatic design, by the way, because this was a lightning talk and I spent like 15 seconds having the conversation I just took 3 minutes on, there's a URL on almost every slide that will take you to mountains more information about each of these topics, because we're not going to go that deep because there's still 16 more or something. Abstract your requirements. Nobody has a requirement for some number of liters per minute of water at a certain temperature plus some number of liters per minute of water at a different temperature. Like, that's not how we think. We're like, I want water that's comfortable for me for my shower or my bath. What comes out of the wall or the database doesn't look like what the user wants. And so making that connection, when you've got this hot and cold, there's a lot of different ways to mix hot and cold. Like physically, there's a lot of different ways to implement how do you mix hot and cold to get to the temperature that you want. So if you can abstract that, you're talking about plotting a point in a 2D vector space to get a temperature angle and a velocity length, and you want that. And there's a lot of ways to implement water coming out of the wall with that particular vector configuration. This occurred to me when I went home to Portland to visit my dad, and he put in a new shower, and there was a new shower control, and I'd never seen one like that before. And then I realized, like, there's all kinds. There's the hot and the cold are separate. There's the one knob in the middle that you tip side by side. If you go to like a campsite, like there's a button, and you get whatever temperature comes out of the wall for, like, there's all different ways to implement this thing. And if I can abstract what I need, finding this point in vector space, there's a lot of different ways to implement it. So you can start there. You can also at that point say what other industries or what other problems look like this problem in this abstract way. How did they solve it in reality once we've said that these are abstractly similar? And I can look at these other existing domains of solutions and bring that back to my solution. So track your assumptions. The problem with assumptions is we don't really think about them and talk about them out loud because duh, like everybody knows, right? If you can write them down, this is super useful. And then you get other people on the team to write down their assumptions, and you can compare them, right? Like, these are like trading cards. Like, oh, you thought we were making an app? Like, I thought we were making a responsive website. Like, well, we should probably figure that out, right? And of course, it goes much deeper than that in terms of assuming who are your customers, what are the capabilities that we need to fulfill. And this is what a requirements document is, right? It's the contract that says we're going to write down everything we think we need to communicate so that we're all on the same page and the assumptions aren't hidden and aren't going to bite us. But it's good to question them, like, why should we do an app versus a responsive website, or the other way around? Is this even a product we want to be working on? Like, is this a product that needs to exist in the world? Like, just because we're assuming that drone-enabled, 1-hour pet food delivery is an awesome thing, like, is that really how we want to spend our life's choices? So disrupt them. Like, what if this wasn't a constraint that we had? What if we didn't have this assumption? What would that mean for our product? How would that change all the evolution, all the decisions that flow downhill from there? And finally, being able to disprove them. Being able to say, like, that's fine, but I don't think it's true. Like, we can challenge that. Maybe that's not the right answer for us. And then again, you open up much broader avenues, more choices, and more opportunities for success. So here's a little quote. This is from my friend Danielle, who was actually here yesterday. This is a much more poetic way of saying what I say on the next slide, but I wanted to put this in because this is a pleasant way of saying it. Sometimes we need a little creative constraint because the world is infinite. For me, there's basically nothing in the world more terrifying than a blank page. And no joke, like, the reason that I teach process and I write books about how to do stuff is because I was terrified and I had to, like, build a process for myself to get past the paralysis, the overwhelm of the blank page and the infinite of the possibilities. And so when you can introduce constraints of whatever kind, you can now narrow and focus. This is the opposite of what I've just been telling you, where I said, remove all your constraints, remove your preconceived notions, think bigger. Now I'm saying, add some things intentionally to focus what's possible. So the way I phrased that was introduce constructive constraints. And this, these guardrails will keep you on the road instead of going cross country for the rest of your days trying to find a good solution. My favorite constraint, I'm not going to get to my favorite constraint yet. We even have a mythology about this, which is, there's a couple of entrepreneurs in a garage and they can't afford much and they've got to hack it together themselves. Like, this entire story is the magic of constraints. It's the magic of not having the infinite resources, not having the tools you want, having to fake things to put them together, and somehow it works out better, and you're required to find an alternate solution that's beyond the obvious one because you can't afford the obvious one, or you don't have the time, or you don't have enough employees to build the thing that is the obvious way to do it, that everyone's always done it, and so you innovate. So my favorite constraint these days No joke, get rid of drop-downs. Drop-downs are bad UI. I'm totally not kidding. I'm saying this with a completely straight face. Drop-downs are bad UI. There's a few cases where they're justifiable, but most of the time you probably shouldn't be using them. And it's a really fun exercise, particularly if you're working on like upping your interaction design game. Go through whatever it is you're building and say, do we really need a drop-down there, or can we do this in a better way? If it's a list of countries, like, yeah, we all know what's going to be there and we can probably find the value, and there's a lot of them, we don't want to spell them all out, but man, if you have 3 choices and you put it behind a drop-down, you are just like bludgeoning your users while they're trying to get something done. Like, that's a really bad idea. So this is just a little game that you can play with yourself and your design staff. Pursue bigger, better boxes. I was at a conference almost 10 years ago, and somebody was talking about how, well, first of all, like, raise your hand if you're an out-of-the-box thinker. And all the designers are like, oh, of course, I'm totally an out-of-the-box thinker. It's like, no, you're not. You have a box. You think within your box. That's why it's your box. That you can't ever not think in your box. And if you start to think in new ways, you've just made your box a little bit bigger. So how do you get a bigger box? You need a team, because you have like your little box, right? And then if you get a team, you can have a little bigger box because you put your boxes together. But if everyone on your team looks like you and thinks like you, the bigger box is not very much bigger. And the weirder boxes and the stranger boxes and the bigger, more interesting boxes come from having a bigger, weirder, stranger, more diverse team. You need people who have other perspectives, thank you, because that's the only way you're going to get new ideas, and that's the only way you're going to get out of your box. You've got to diversify the thinking. Speaking of which, apparently, according to this ad from the 50s, no 2 families are alike. You can tell because the son in this one has dark hair in the second family and is blonde in the first family. This is a radical diversity here. For real, this is a print ad from John Hancock in the 50s. So I'm the room host here. I started the session talking about Genevieve Bell this morning, who's an anthropologist who sort of accidentally got a job at Intel, and now she's a senior fellow at Intel. She's an Australian. She's a university professor, and her whole career has been made out of sort of examining how does technology impact society and culture and vice versa, and how do these things go back and forth. And I saw her speak last year, and the thing she said that stuck with me the most was, who's missing from the future that you're designing? And she showed ads, this is the inspiration for this ad, she showed ads of these very, very white families like in these giant cars cruising down the interstate, and it was talking about how fabulous the interstate highway system was going to be, and this was the future, but it was this very, very narrow version of the future. And there was one kind of family represented in this vision of the future, and nobody else was there. And in contrast to this, you can think about the original Star Trek in the 60s, right? So this is civil rights era, right? The United States is going through some heavy stuff, and there's a starship, and it's the future, and there's a black woman driving a starship. Sorry, I get a little choked up about this. It was not a vision of the future that was popular in the media, in science fiction, because all the other science fiction from that era was like, you know, a lot of white dudes who were Boy Scouts and then built rocket ships, right? And to have this inclusive vision that there was different races, that there was different ethnicities, that there was different roles, and all these people were participating in the future was radical. That they were designing, they were envisioning a future that was bigger than the future they had that day, that was being generated by the other sources. So think about the future you're designing, think about who's included, think about the abilities, think about the backgrounds. It's real because you'll design better products. A moment of survey. How many of you prefer to drive manual transmission? It's a pretty good bet. 20 or 30% of the audience. What fraction of new cars sold in the United States have manual transmissions these days? Anybody know? People are saying small. Yeah, it's under 5%. So there's 20 or 30% of the people in this room who prefer them, maybe don't drive them, but it's a very small fraction of the market. So there's an example of, we as designers, we may have a bias, but the broad market, the broad audience doesn't include that. It doesn't necessarily reflect that. There's been a lot of talk recently about Uber and some of their institutionalized policies. This was Susan Fowler, former engineer from Uber, wrote about that. So for the people in the room who present as male only, how many of you have worked at companies where that's a problem? we got 1 or 2, 3 maybe. And it's probably an even-ish gender balance in this room. How many women have worked at companies where that's a problem? More than 2 or 3, by a wide margin, right? I'm sure some of you who worked at the same companies as some of the other people here. The fact that some of the people in this room are not aware that they've worked at companies where that's a problem is totally par for the course. This is another example of you need a bigger box to really understand what's going on. You need a bigger box to really be able to design more effectively. Work up here instead of down here. So data is really exciting. I've been involved for many years at O'Reilly's Strata conference, which is their big data conference, and I teach people who are doing visualizations of data, and people are super excited about data, and I'm thinking like that's a baby step. Like it's a lot of work to get the data started, but you need to refine that, and you need to refine it into information, and from there you can get to answers, and eventually you can enable and facilitate actions, and finally you can get to solutions. And the thing is that the higher up that stack you can get, the more value you can deliver, right? So for example, this is Amazon's Dash button, where you push the button and whatever the button is branded to shows up in your Amazon cart and shows up at your house. I don't know, by the way, whoever decided to name a trash bag brand Glad, but that is genius, because I've never met someone who was glad to take out the trash, unless the trash is really smelly or something. But the point here is that you can take data and refine it and give people information, and that's pretty good. And if you're smart and your algorithms aren't horrible, you can give them some answers, and that's pretty great. And to be able to then enable an action, like this is an action, this is one click, right? One click for the physical world. That's pretty amazing. Even beyond that is the complete solution, like maybe a subscription model, which isn't always exactly what people need or isn't always the best thing. But there's this whole hierarchy of what you're delivering to people, and I see teams get really excited about like moving this up one notch. And that's a good start, but then they stop the thinking there. And it's like, well, can you do more for the user? Can you bring it closer to them? Can you move further towards what the user's mental model is or what the next action they're going to take is? And you have to be confident to do it right. You don't want to be ordering trash bags for people who don't want them, for example, but the intention of moving closer to the user. So this is a menu, like we've all seen restaurant menus. How are they arranged? Yeah, chronologically, in a sequence of what you eat. Your menu is a timeline, more or less, like the drinks at the bottom. We probably don't all chug the drink at the end of the meal, but you know, we start with the appetizers or the starters. Maybe there's a little salad and a soup in there. Maybe there's a pasta plate and an entree, and then a dessert. And there's probably some other sections as well. But this is not how it's stored in the database, right? We might, if we were to store everything on the menu in our database, that's all my stuff, you can move it. If we were to store everything on the menu in the database, it would probably be sorted by name. We could probably look it up by calorie, maybe the price. But most users aren't thinking on those axes. Most users are thinking like, what am I in the mood for? Are there vegetarian options? What flavors are going to go together? So there's this massive gap between the representation of the knowledge in our electronic systems and the mental model of the people who are going to use it. And you get to pick where on the spectrum between the two of them your interface goes. And is your interface going to do the work of translating from what comes out of the database to make it easier for the user to consume, or are you going to ask the user to do that translation? This is, by the way, just like the problem of the hot and the cold coming out of the wall, right? And if you went to a fancy hotel now and they had hot with one knob and one spigot and cold another one, you'd be like, that's pretty primitive. Like, how come you guys didn't do the work for me and tied the pipes together and put a better control on it for me? Same thing with your data, same thing with your user interfaces. Understand how people are going to use it, and if you can move your interface closer to the mental model, hopefully learning from the user's mental model rather than forcing them to learn yours, you get more satisfaction. This is my favorite metaphor for the web. So the beautiful thing about hypertext is you can link anything to anything, but the terrible thing about hypertext is you can link anything to anything, right? And so at some level, that's a cheat, it's a hack. It means we don't have to structure things very effectively. We can just put links wherever we want them and make them go anywhere else, and well, my job's done, the link to the thing exists and we're good. But it can be really hard on the users to do that. How many of you guys work with Ajax? How many of you work with JavaScript? Okay, so Ajax is what we called JavaScript 10 years ago when it was a brand new thing before everybody did it all the time. I only bring that up because Jesse James Garrett coined the phrase Ajax. I remain amazed and perplexed at how often people think they can solve an information architecture problem with interaction design, right? That's what happened here. It's not where it should be. We're just going to point you over to where it ought to be, except they didn't actually include the forwarding address here. It was just this location doesn't exist anymore. I want to see that on a Google map, just like the void. I've written books on visualization. I do that because that's how my brain works, and I think in diagrams. By the way, you're all visual learners, and you're all auditory learners. There is no, I'm this kind of a learner style, I'm that kind of a learner style. That's completely bogus. We're all visual people. We all learn through these multitude of ways. It's just bad science. There's no research to support it, so stop repeating that myth. But we're all visual, which is true. For me to be able to understand something well, if I can't diagram it, then I know I don't understand it. And I've seen this with other groups too, where I go to help a group and they've got their information architecture, and I'm like, that's kind of, I don't say this word out loud, but I'm like, that's kind of ugly. What happened there in your sitemap or your user journey or whatever? And they're like, oh, yeah, it wasn't like that, but then the customer called and the PM said we had to add this feature so that they could do this thing. And so I'm like, okay, so that means you don't understand the requirements because the PM doesn't understand the requirements because the customer said, we want this thing, and they had no idea what they were asking for really and the implications of it. And what happens is you end up with diagrams that look like this because you can't draw the diagram if you don't understand it. And so the diagram is useful as a two-way tool. One, if you can't draw the diagram usefully, you don't understand it and you need to go learn more or get better requirements. But two, it also does this thinking for you before you start to go build wireframes, before you start to build your whatevers, right? And it guides you, it tells you what the connections are. This is literally, well not this, but this is literally the blueprint for how are you gonna build the thing. The analogy that I like is people, you don't say I'm gonna build a house and it's gonna have a kitchen and a bathroom and a hallway and a living room and some bedrooms, and then you don't just go build a kitchen. And then we're going to build a hallway down from it. And then you sort of, like, it wouldn't work. The doorways wouldn't line up. And like, it's an absurd notion of how to build a house without having a single blueprint. But we do this for digital stuff all the time. And we just kind of hope that the doorways line up and the navigation makes sense to people. And of course it doesn't a lot of the time because there's not a vision. There's not a coherent map or diagram or path that says this is how all these pieces relate together in a coherent way. And you can get away with it for a while, but as what you build becomes more complex and more interesting and you get more weird edge cases like, oh, we recognize you, but you're not yet signed in. That's a different path from we don't recognize you, even though maybe you have an account, or someone who has to sign in and create an account, or you're already signed in. Like, tiny little changes, but each of those is going to push me through a different loop and I'm going to end up in a different place when I come in. So draw the map or the diagram. The next couple of slides actually relate pretty well to Gretchen's talk a minute ago. What could possibly go wrong? An XKCD here. 2 in a row, actually. Do you remember, well, so this particular one talks about preparing for humans or users who are intentionally malicious. But there's lots of other versions too, right? With the intentional maliciousness, do you remember a year ago Microsoft's chatbot on Twitter? Like, it was great. It'll learn from what people tweet at it. And within a few hours, it was like the most horrible, most racist, most offensive account on Twitter, because that's what people were tweeting at it. And they were like, oh, we never thought of that, and shut it down. It's like, have you used Twitter? Like, what did you think? What did you think was going to happen when you said you can teach our robot? They didn't think about that. The other one from also right around the same time last spring was Google's drop the mic April Fool's hack, where that orange button right next to the send button, near where the send and archive button used to be, was the send and drop the mic button. And what that does is it sends this drop the mic GIF to your whole conversation thread and mutes the thread so you never see it again. Which is really cute and clever unless you're talking about work on a deadline. And people lost their jobs because they accidentally clicked the wrong button, because Gmail shouldn't destroy your career, probably. And so they sent this drop the mic GIF and never saw any other correspondence. And people were like, hello, why are you not writing me back? We have a deadline, what's going on? And they never heard any of this, and then there was huge problems. Google didn't think of this. Randomly, somehow didn't think what could possibly go wrong, and it was really, really bad for some people. Think about this stuff. So there's the malicious actors. There's also just like Sometimes things go badly, and what's going to happen? How is your product going to react in that situation? How can you ameliorate or somehow fix what that's going to be like? Sometimes people are just lazy. Sometimes people just don't do the right thing. This is a huge argument for strong defaults. Make your default values useful so that if people don't do anything or don't do the right thing, you still get the behavior that you want. Here's a quotable, and it's not on the slide, but I'm going to say it slow so everybody can tweet it. If the success of your system depends on humans doing the right thing, your system's going to fail. Someday. Because your humans are not going to do all the right thing all the time. And so don't build systems that depend on humans always doing it right. Build systems that are going to be pretty much doing the right thing even when humans don't work out well. So this slide is because Chernobyl had a couple of bad things going on. Chernobyl, so there's different, so I was when I was in college, we had a research reactor, so I'm a federally licensed nuclear reactor operator, though it's been 20 years since I've been up to date with my qualifications. But so Chernobyl, there's different reactor technologies, and some of them, as they get hotter, become less reactive and shut themselves down. I approve of this. Some of them, as they get hotter, become more reactive and get hotter and become more reactive and get hotter. That wigs me out a little bit. Chernobyl was the latter design, so already it's not designed for human action. They were running some tests, they shut down some safety systems, things looked bad in the test, they didn't believe their instrumentation, so they did the opposite of the correct action, and it got bad. Ideally, you'd have a situation that wouldn't have happened, but this was not how all these pieces came together. By the way, here's an example of a positive system, a system that does the right thing in absence of human action. Direct deposit. How awesome is direct deposit where you don't have to carry around a piece of paper and find a bank that's open during banker's hours when you're supposed to be at work and no, direct deposit. It's a beautiful thing. That's a system that is designed well for human inaction. You set it up once, it just goes until you quit the company or change your bank or something. All right. All those were techniques for designing things well. We're going to segue now into finding the right problems to solve. Track your annoyances. Your annoyances are powerful indicators of opportunities in the world to make the world a better place, because probably the things that annoy you annoy other people as well. This is a design strategy. This is I've seen this done as an academic problem. Keep a bug list. We've all got these tiny little notebooks now that we picked up at one of the booths out here. Write down all the things that bother you. A friend of mine had this as an academic assignment, and one of his was toast. I don't eat enough toast. I really enjoy toast. Why don't I eat more toast? And that presumably led him to some thinking about the dynamics of his grocery shopping and the toaster and time in the morning and I don't know what all else. But so things that bother you, but also things that you're resigned to, wow, traffic's really bad and housing's really expensive. Oh, well, I guess I'll just sit in my car for 90 more minutes because I can't afford to live where I work. Maybe there's solutions to these things. Root cause analysis. Do you work at places where you've got the drip coffee maker like this, where it drips into the big carafe? Anybody? Maybe? So we have these at work, and usually about twice a month I'll walk by, so there's the grounds that are in the little paper sleeve up on top, and then they fill the carafe, and they put it on the side, and they get a cup of coffee and walk away, and it drips. And so somebody picks up a piece of paper, which they're going to then throw away, which somebody cut down a tree to make, and they put it underneath to catch the drips. I would fire an engineer I saw doing that. I'm not joking, because that is someone who's not capable of understanding the problem space, right? They're doing zero analysis to understand why there's coffee on the bottom of the thing. If they spent 2 more seconds thinking about it, they would realize they could take the little handle that's right in front of them and is bright yellow, dump it in the compost, and then the drips would stop and they wouldn't have to throw away another cup trying to catch the drips because they're actually making more work and using more resources. So do some root cause analysis. There's an approach called the 5 whys. And so the first why might be, why is there a cup in the coffee machine? It's well, it's to catch the drips. Well, why are there drips? Well, because somebody made coffee and the thing still, well, why? Oh, it's still, oh, that's the problem, is that there's still wet grounds that are dripping. Now we have a solution. So this 5 whys, this is one of the many useful techniques that came out of Toyota, I don't even know when, this is an older one, mid 20th century, I think. But the 5 whys, why is it that way? Why did that happen? What are the circumstances that led to that? And then, and you don't fix just the fact that there's one drip here now today, you say, how can we put a system in place because if your system depends on human action, it's going to fail. How do we put a system in place that doesn't fail because it's not based on humans doing the right thing? By the way, when you're doing this, you may hear the passive voice. There's lots of examples that I could use that I probably shouldn't use from stage about like, these things just keep happening. I don't know how, they just keep happening. If you remember the Vietnam era, there was the phrase, mistakes were made. Okay, I believe you. You know, mistakes were made over there. We don't know. Like there's this very absentee lack of ownership. So the passive voice is a great indicator that probably there is a party that is responsible or at least involved, and asking some more whys or doing a little more digging, you might find out what's going on actually and have an opportunity to solve it. This one's kind of fun. I saw not this diagram, but one sort of thematically similar in like 2008, and I've never been able to find it again, which is one of the great frustrations of my life. When I saw this in 2008, it was, what we're doing here is we're taking some relevant axes to classify communication technologies. And we're plotting the existing communication technologies along these axes and seeing where the gaps are. And if you think back to 2008, there's this lower corner here down on the right with things like Twitter and Snapchat and Facebook and YouTube. And in 2008, most of those were very, very young. But if you had been watching the market and you'd been understanding what was going on with the market, you'd say, wow, there isn't really a one-to-many asynchronous technology that's out there for people right now. We have one-to-one asynchronous, it's called writing a letter, right? We have one-to-one synchronous, that's a phone call. But we don't have this asynchronous and this one-to-many. I mean, if you own a radio station, you do, but not as an individual. And there was this space in the market that existed that a number of companies filled in a number of very different ways. And in hindsight, you're like, well, of course we needed those. Of course, how do we ever live without Twitter and Facebook? I don't know, but somebody had to say there's this room in the market for these products, and this product category is not covered by an existing technology. So this is not quite as interesting a version of the graph as the one that I saw. But the notion here is that if you can plot some axes of really relevant axes and put the current players in the space, you can see where the gaps are. And where the gaps are, maybe there's an opportunity. Sometimes there's not opportunities. Like I think one of them was, I don't remember what it was, one-to-many synchronous short form or something. It just, there was some permutation that just didn't make sense. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but so let's talk about analyzing markets a little bit. This is Wardley mapping, a guy named Simon Wardley, who's sort of a cantankerous IT enterprise industry expert and commentator. And Wardley mapping is based on the notion, as you read across the bottom scale, don't worry about the vertical scale much, but the bottom scale, technologies move from being these where it says Genesis in the lower left corner there, from being unique, handmade, custom, you can't just get them, and then more and more they develop. It's not just one person in their shop. Now you can go hire someone to do it. That's the custom built. And then they become productized or rental. And then they become commodity to the point of becoming utility, right? So at this point, like, Wi-Fi is getting towards the commodity/utility end of things, right? And like I remember a time when having a Wi-Fi card was kind of a big deal, and now you'd be shocked if your new device or the hotel you were staying didn't have Wi-Fi. Like, what, do you have water? Like, come on. Similarly with storage, cloud storage, at this point, we don't have to talk about it. You use S3, move on. Like, this isn't a thing we have to have a conversation about. If you go all the way back, people used to hand build computer memory, like out of wires. We're no longer in that place. But this notion is that all of these technologies move through this life cycle. And if you plot the dependencies of an industry or a technology on this map, you can see, oh, that's a spot where we believe that technology that this whole industry depends on is going to move. And when that moves, this whole industry is going to collapse or at least radically change. So that's a very important notion, that these technologies are going to change and massive industries are going to change with them. So the example that Simon Wardley gives here is he's talking about making a television show. And it used to be that all the hardware, the cameras and the video mixing and the distribution network, that was all, like, you couldn't have that. You couldn't own a television broadcast station. Even just the video cameras, the television cameras were incredibly expensive. The mixing boards are incredibly expensive. And you had to have talent and scripts and, the actors, and you had to, get it to your customers. And so he's plotted this here, and now we see customers, distribution. That's actually pretty easy. A website, streaming, like, you can have that. You can set up your own TV channel. The far left edge, the artistic direction, the production talent, that's harder, right? You can't just download an actor or a script. I mean, you could, but they wouldn't be very good. So those are harder to substitute, but all these other technologies are moving very quickly to the right. And so we've seen, literally, in the last few years, we've seen the balance of power shift from the traditional networks and movie studios and broadcasters that had a lot of money to invest to very, very successful independent work, because you don't need to go buy a dedicated video camera. You have one in your pocket. You don't need to buy dedicated software, high-end, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per seat software or hardware to manipulate your video. No, it's 99 cents on the App Store, right? You don't need to set up a whole, broadcast antenna network and license airwaves like we have YouTube. So these things are moving to the right very quickly, and entire industries that depend on the exclusivity of technology, entire industries collapse when they no longer have the exclusivity of the inconvenience of getting access to that technology. I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit. So you're predicting the future, but it's inevitable. You don't necessarily know the velocity that some of these are going to change, but you can say with some certainty these things are going to change. So this is Wardley mapping. As I mentioned earlier, there's links at the bottom that talk about all these things. Pursue much bigger boxes. This is actually not accurate because that box is in Seattle. Move it like 4 millimeters over to get to the Bay Area. A lot of us have spent a lot of our careers designing products for a lot of people that look a lot like us. There's a much bigger world out there. There's a lot more interesting things to do than a lot of what a lot of us spend our time on. But you got to think bigger. You got to go for that. Tim O'Reilly, who we have to thank for O'Reilly Publishing and this conference, among others, has been saying for many years, work on stuff that matters. Tim, by the way, is a fascinating guy. Liberal arts degree, so shout out to getting a liberal arts degree before you move into technology. He thinks about the big picture in a lot of ways, and so he's been talking about working on stuff that matters. And there's 3 points of this. Work on something that matters to you more than money. So not that the good work you do should be a charity, but you should do the work also because you believe it. Now, hopefully, the good work that you do because you believe in it also is at least financially sustainable. But hopefully, there's some purpose there that engages you beyond just the money. Create more value than you capture. It's great if you've got a product that's out there making money in the world, and it's even better if the product that you're creating is helping other people do the work that they're doing. So I work for Amazon Web Services, and bizarrely, morally, I feel pretty good about that because, we're doing pretty well, it's like a $12 billion a year company. But man, there are so many companies. We have millions of customers who are building their products on top of our technology. All these people, the thing I was just talking about, that disintermediation, we're letting other people do that. We're letting other people build their dreams, start their companies based on the stuff that we're providing. So we're capturing quite a lot of value, but we're enabling a huge amount more for everybody else. Same thing with, for example, the iPhone, right? Apple's making plenty of money on the iPhone, and they're enabling a whole lot more people to distribute their technology as well. Number 3, take the long view, not just this release or this quarter or this stock vest, but what are the longer implications of what I'm working on, and how is that going to affect things in the longer picture? I'm going to try. We'll see if this works. I'm mousing almost blind here. This is one conversation about working on stuff that matters.
While Jobs pursued his Mac mission, he needed a more orthodox chief executive to run the company. A respectable face who could sell to corporate America. He chose Pepsi-Cola executive John Sculley. Sculley refused. Leave Pepsi for a 4-year-old company that had been set up in a garage? Are you serious? But it was hard saying no to Steve Jobs.
And then he looked up at me and just stared at me with this stare that only Steve Jobs has. And he said, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" And I just gulped because I knew I would wonder for the rest of my life, what I would have missed.
Yeah. The most famous example in the history of tech recruiting of work on stuff that matters. Not very long after that, Sculley fired Steve Jobs. That's not really germane to the conversation. It all worked out in the end, but that's a pretty blunt statement of like, are what you're dedicating your life to, like, is that really relevant? Do y'all know Brett Victor? You should go to worrydream.com and read everything on it. Brett Victor is an amazing holistic design thinker. I think one of the most interesting design thinkers working today. And he sort of, there's a little essay here where he said, I was tweeting some snarky and regrettable things, and Twitter's a great platform for snarky and regrettable, but I was tweeting about how we have misplaced priorities. So some of these tweets up here, if you can't read it. If any founders out there want to disrupt our 401 parts per million atmospheric CO2 or, quote, moonshot ocean acidification, that would be cool, right? Worrying about sentient AI as the ice caps melt is like standing on the tracks as the train rushes in, worrying about being hit by lightning. And so somebody wrote back and said, so what do we do, Brett? And he said, I'm glad you asked. And he wrote a very long list of a very small number of suggestions of what technologists can do about climate change. This is the only issue, I don't want to say the only issue that matters, because that's totally not true, but it is the single largest issue that you and I face, that humanity faces, that humanity has ever faced. If you're anything like me, you're a little bit paralyzed by fear about it. And moving on, there was a great graphic, I should have put it in here, about number of people in the United States, by county, that believe that climate change is real and will affect people. And it's most counties by a margin. Number of people who think it's going to affect them, and it's like way lower. It's like, really? Because it's already happening. Like, you're in California, right? We have drought. Like, this is a thing. So just a tiny bit of straight talk. It's terrifying. It is the biggest thing, and it is terrifying. And in our lifetimes, and absolutely in our children's lifetimes, it's really going to change everything. And I don't say that hyperbolically. We're already seeing wars. Syria, right? Syria's agriculture is decimated because of climate change, and that has political implications all over the world. The California drought, the weathers in the Northeast, all of this is real, and it's happening, and it's only going to get worse. And that's terrifying. And for me, it's overwhelming and it's paralyzing. But it's the biggest technological opportunity. It's the biggest cultural opportunity. It's the biggest financial opportunity in the history of humanity, because we're going to rebuild how all of culture works. And that's not an exaggeration. Because everything that we have built our cities on, all of our transportation infrastructure, all of our agriculture, all of the financial markets, they're all based on the valuation of this carbon bubble, right? This economy that's built on burning gas and oil and coal, and that's going to change, and it's going to change very, very quickly, and it's going to change extremely radically, and it's going to make people who are there extremely wealthy, and it's going to leave the people who are defending, with all the propaganda, who are defending the current carbon economy, it's going to leave them behind, and when that happens, they're going to become irrelevant extremely quickly. Wind and solar power is already cheaper than coal if you take away subsidies from coal. Renewable energy already employs more people in the United States than the petrochemical industry, than all the petro energy. And wind just surpassed hydroelectric in terms of our generation capacity in the United States. It is changing extremely rapidly, and even the people who do this for a career, who are paying attention, are shocked at how quickly things are changing. The opportunities are real. It's going to make some people very rich, hopefully some people in this room. There is reason for hope, and I'm not going to get into it, but there is reason for hope. There's a fabulous essay linked at the bottom of this, written by Alex Steffen, who's been working on this for 20 years, a good friend of mine. And he's talking about the ways in which the financial incentives are going to be so great that the change is going to happen whether or not Exxon wants it to or not, whether or not the presidential administrations want to or not. And we are one of the few big countries in the world that has not gotten its act together. China is so far ahead. China has given up on coal completely. They are building solar so quickly. The world is moving, and we'll get in gear sooner or later. We can't not, and it'll happen. Here's the sticking point. You can't create a world that you can't imagine. We need imaginative people to go out and envision how good it can be. And there's been a lot of propaganda saying, that's not reasonable. That's far too expensive. It's like, have you looked at the price of not changing? Like, Manhattan's still going to be there. It's just going to be underwater. How much is that going to cost? If you're a creative person, you have an amazing opportunity, maybe an obligation, to think about how amazing the world could be and put that out there. Share your dreams. We need problem solvers. So go solve the right problems.